By late 1943, nearly 50 secret airstrips operated deep inside German-occupied Belarus, invisible from the air during daylight, active only in darkness when partisan sentries lit fires along runways carved from forest clearings. More than 500,000 Soviet partisans controlled entire districts behind enemy lines, territories where German occupation existed only in name, while actual administration, food production, and military coordination happened through partisan-controlled village Soviets. The Red Air Force flew supply missions almost nightly, delivering weapons, medicines, radio equipment, and specialists, while evacuating wounded fighters and civilians who would otherwise die in the forest. German reconnaissance flights never found most of these airstrips despite flying over them repeatedly. This is the story of how partisan engineers built functional airports in swamps and forests using hand tools, how pilots navigated to clearings marked only by campfires, and how an improvised logistics network kept resistance forces supplied when parachute drops proved inadequate for sustaining 500,000 fighters operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. The Polikarpov P-02 biplane was obsolete by 1942 standards, a wood and canvas training aircraft with a maximum speed of 60 miles per hour when fully loaded. Its open cockpits exposed pilot and navigator to freezing winter air. Its fabric skin offered no protection against even small arms fire, and it carried so few instruments that night navigation required visual reference to ground features barely visible in darkness. But the P-02 possessed one capability that made it invaluable for partisan supply operations. It could land on almost anything that resembled a runway, including forest clearings 800 meters long and 50 meters wide. Normal military airstrips required extensive engineering, grading to create level surfaces, drainage systems to prevent flooding, reinforced runways that could support repeated aircraft operations. The partisan airstrips had none of this infrastructure. They were simply clearings in the forest where trees had been felled, stumps removed or cut flush with ground level, and the resulting space compacted by repeated rolling with logs pulled by horses. Many were located in swampy terrain considered impassable by German forces, protected by natural obstacles rather than defensive fortifications. Camouflage made these airstrips nearly invisible from above. During daylight hours, partisans covered the cleared area with cut branches, arranged to match the surrounding forest canopy from aerial perspective. Young trees were planted along the edges to blur the boundary between forest and clearing. Unused runways were deliberately allowed to grow weeds and grass, maintaining the illusion of natural meadow rather than artificial construction. German aerial reconnaissance photographed these locations repeatedly without recognizing them as operational airfields. The development of partisan airstrips began in early 1942, when Soviet High Command recognized that parachute drops alone couldn't supply the growing partisan movement. Dropping supplies by parachute was inefficient, with significant losses when containers fell into swamps, trees, or German-controlled areas. Weather frequently prevented drops, leaving partisan units without resupply for weeks at a time. Wounded partisans who could be saved with proper medical treatment died in the forest because evacuation was impossible. The partisan movement needed direct air connection to Soviet-controlled territory, which meant building airstrips in occupied Belarus. The Vitebsk Gate, a 40-kilometer gap in German defensive lines northwest of Vitebsk, provided the opportunity. Soviet forces maintained a small bridgehead on the western side of this gap, creating a land corridor through which personnel and supplies could flow into partisan-controlled areas. But the corridor was vulnerable to German attack and frequently blocked by combat operations. Air transport offered an alternative that didn't depend on holding specific territory, as long as partisan units could build and maintain landing sites deep in the forest. In anticipation of the Vitebsk Gate's eventual closure, Soviet command sent specialist teams into Belarus, starting in spring 1942, with orders to construct covert airstrips. These teams included aviation engineers who understood runway requirements, surveyors who could identify suitable locations, and experienced construction supervisors who could organize partisan labor. They arrived with minimal equipment, mostly hand tools and measuring instruments, because heavy machinery would be impossible to conceal from German observation. Site selection required balancing multiple factors. The location needed to be in territory controlled by strong partisan units who could provide security and labor. The terrain needed to support aircraft operations without extensive engineering work. The site needed to be invisible from German positions and from the air, which meant choosing locations surrounded by dense forest. And the approach paths for landing and takeoff needed to be clear of obstacles that would endanger low-flying aircraft at night. The Naliboki forest in western Belarus became a major centre for partisan airstrip construction. This vast wilderness of dense pine forest, open meadows, and extensive swampland provided perfect conditions for partisan operations. German forces rarely entered the Naliboki forest because the terrain made conventional military operations nearly impossible. The few roads that penetrated the forest were easily blocked and ambushed. The swamps prevented cross-country vehicle movement. Local populations were either supportive of partisans or too frightened to report partisan activities to German authorities. Construction of an airstrip began with selecting a natural meadow or clearing approximately 1,000 meters long and 100 meters wide. Partisan laborers, usually several hundred people working in shifts, spent weeks clearing the site under conditions that made every task exponentially harder. Trees within the runway area were cut down using hand saws and axes, back-breaking work that left hands blistered and bleeding after hours of repetitive soaring motion. Stumps had to be removed by digging around the roots with shovels and picks, excavating deep enough to expose major roots that were then severed one by one before teams of horses could pull the stump free. Some stumps were 3 feet in diameter, requiring days of work to remove completely. Rocks cleared from the surface, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, had to be rolled or levered onto crude sledges and dragged away. The entire area was then rolled repeatedly using massive logs pulled by multiple horses, compacting the soil to create a firm surface that would support aircraft weight without creating deep ruts. This rolling process continued for weeks, as soil compaction sufficient for aircraft landing required dozens of passes over every section of runway. Workers walked alongside the log roller, filling depressions with additional soil and removing new stones that emerged from the compressed surface. The physical exhaustion was relentless. Partisan labourers worked 12-hour shifts in summer heat that bred swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies, or in spring mud that clung to boots and made every step an effort. Food was often inadequate, as partisan supply chains struggled to feed combat units, leaving construction workers surviving on bread, potatoes, and occasional meat from animals hunted in the forest. Drainage was critical in the swampy terrain of Belarus. Without proper drainage, runways turned into muddy ponds during spring thaw or after heavy rain, making landing impossible. Partisan engineers dug shallow trenches along both sides of the runway to channel water away from the landing surface. These drainage ditches were carefully camouflaged with vegetation to avoid detection from the air. In particularly swampy areas, partisans laid logs perpendicular to the runway direction, creating a corduroy surface that provided firm support over soft ground. Camouflage installations came next. Tall poles were erected at intervals along the runway edges, with ropes strung between them. During daylight, cut pine branches were tied to these ropes, creating an overhead canopy that broke up the visual signature of the cleared area when viewed from above. The branches were replaced every few days as they dried and lost their natural colour. From German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at several thousand feet altitude, these camouflaged airstrips appeared as irregular forest clearings, indistinguishable from natural meadows. Navigation aids were primitive but effective. Partisans established radio contact with incoming aircraft using receivers and transmitters supplied through earlier parachute drops. As the aircraft approached, partisan sentries positioned along the runway's length would light small fires, creating a line of light points marking the landing surface. These fires were made from wood that produced minimal smoke, usually birch bark, which burned hot and bright without creating visible smoke plumes that might attract German attention. The fires were lit only when the aircraft was within a few minutes of landing, minimized the time the airstrip was visibly active. Landing at night on a forest airstrip was extraordinarily dangerous, combining multiple risk factors into a situation where survival depended on skill, luck, and partisan ground crew competence. The pilot had only firelight to judge altitude and speed, with no electronic instruments to assist beyond a basic altimeter and compass. These instruments provided limited information. Altitude was relative to sea level rather than actual ground clearance, and compass readings required interpretation to account for magnetic deviation. The Po-2's low stall speed of 30 miles per hour made night forest landings slightly less suicidal than they would be with faster aircraft, but crashing was common enough that experienced partisan ground crews developed efficient techniques for extracting injured pilots from wrecked aircraft. The approach to landing was guided entirely by visual reference to the line of fires marking the runway. A pilot who misjudged altitude might land too hard, the landing gear collapsing on impact and sending the aircraft skidding across the runway on its belly, sparks flying from metal contact with stone and earth. The fabric fuselage often caught fire from these sparks, giving ground crew only seconds to pull pilot and navigator clear before flames engulfed the cockpit. Coming in too fast meant overrunning the runway into trees at the far end, a collision that rarely left survivors as the wooden fuselage shattered against tree trunks and the engine ripped free to crush anyone in the forward cockpit. Too slow meant stalling before reaching the runway and crashing into forest bordering the approach path, the aircraft disappearing into darkness with a sound of breaking branches followed by silence or screaming. Wind posed particular challenges because partisan airstrips had no wind indicators beyond smoke from the marker fires. A crosswind could push the aircraft off the runway center line during final approach, forcing the pilot to crab sideways to maintain proper heading, a maneuver requiring precise judgment of wind speed and direction based solely on how much the aircraft drifted. Strong gusts could flip the light Po-2 during landing rollout if a wing caught wind while ground speed was still high. The pilot's only defense was to land as quickly as possible and apply brakes immediately, hoping to get the aircraft stopped before wind could lift it back into the air or tip it onto its wing. Weather during approach was invisible until the aircraft descended below cloud cover, which might be only a few hundred feet above ground level. Pilots approached their target altitude carefully, watching for the first glimpse of fires that indicated the runway location. If clouds extended to ground level, creating fog that obscured the marker fires, the pilot had to make an immediate decision. Attempt landing based on radio guidance from partisan ground controllers who could describe the runway's approximate position, or abort and return to base, leaving partisan units without supplies for another night. Aborting was professionally humiliating, suggesting the pilot lacked courage or skill, but attempting landing in fog conditions that prevented seeing the runway until seconds before impact was suicidal. The Po-2's two-person crew consisted of a pilot in front and a navigator in back, who also served as bombardier on combat missions. For supply runs to partisan airstrips, the navigator became cargo handler, unloading supplies with help from partisan ground crew who swarmed the aircraft as soon as it stopped rolling. Speed was essential because the aircraft needed to take off before dawn to avoid being visible to German observation. A typical supply run might last only 20 minutes on the ground, 10 minutes to unload supplies and load wounded partisans being evacuated, 5 minutes for the pilot to check the aircraft and prepare for takeoff, 5 minutes of preparation for departure. The supplies delivered to partisan airstrips made the difference between survival and collapse of the partisan movement. Weapons arrived disassembled in wooden crates: rifles, machine guns, mortars, anti-tank rifles, ammunition by the tens of thousands of rounds. Medical supplies included surgical instruments, antibiotics, morphine, bandages, antiseptics that made treating wounded partisans possible in forest hospitals that otherwise had no access to modern medicine. Radio equipment provided partisan commanders with direct communication to Soviet headquarters, transforming isolated guerrilla bands into coordinated military units operating under central direction. Specialized personnel also arrived via these airstrips. Partisan commanders were flown to Soviet-controlled territory for training at partisan warfare schools, then returned to their units with improved tactical skills and updated intelligence about German forces. Political officers arrived to establish Communist Party cells within partisan units, ensuring ideological conformity and reporting on the reliability of partisan commanders. Explosive specialists taught partisans advanced demolition techniques for railway sabotage. Medical personnel provided training to partisan medics who would otherwise learn battlefield medicine through trial and fatal error. The evacuation function of partisan airstrips became increasingly important as partisan operations intensified. Wounded partisans who might recover with proper treatment died in the forest from infections or shock because partisan field hospitals lacked facilities for serious cases. Flying these wounded to Soviet hospitals saved hundreds of lives, maintained morale by demonstrating that partisan command cared about its fighters, and prevented the demoralization that comes from watching comrades die unnecessarily. Civilian evacuations also used these airstrips. Jews who had escaped German ghettos and found refuge with partisan units could be flown to safety behind Soviet lines. Children orphaned by German anti-partisan operations were evacuated rather than left to starve in the forest. Political leaders who needed to report directly to Moscow or receive instructions too sensitive for radio transmission travelled via partisan airstrips. The psychological impact of these flights was enormous, providing tangible proof that partisan-controlled territory was genuinely connected to the Soviet war effort. German intelligence knew partisan airstrips existed, but struggled to locate them. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights photographed vast stretches of Belarusian forest, analysing thousands of images for signs of partisan infrastructure. Occasionally they identified suspicious clearings that might be airstrips, but by the time German forces organised operations to attack these sites, the intelligence was often outdated. Partisan security was so effective that German forces reaching locations identified as airstrips frequently found only abandoned meadows with no evidence of recent activity. Several factors explained German failure to neutralise partisan airstrips. The forests were simply too vast for systematic searching, containing tens of thousands of natural clearings indistinguishable from man-made airstrips. German forces lacked the manpower to occupy these areas permanently, as most combat units were needed at the front line and security divisions couldn't penetrate partisan-controlled territory without massive operations requiring thousands of troops. The partisan intelligence network was far superior in the forest environment, warning of German approaches hours before troops arrived and allowing time to evacuate airstrips and remove incriminating evidence. The few German successes in finding and destroying partisan airstrips had devastating temporary effects but couldn't permanently disrupt partisan aviation operations. In one case, German forces discovered and captured a partisan airstrip in the Ushachi district in autumn 1942. They established an ambush, allowing a PO-2 to land before opening fire, killing the crew and destroying the aircraft. They then fortified the airstrip and waited for additional aircraft, destroying 2 more before partisans realized the airstrip had been compromised. But the partisans simply abandoned that site and began using alternative airstrips, distributed throughout the forest to ensure no single loss would cripple the system. By mid-1943, the partisan airstrip network had expanded to nearly 50 sites across Belarus, Ukraine, and occupied Russian territory. This represented an enormous construction effort, requiring hundreds of thousands of person-hours of labour by partisan units who also had to conduct combat operations, forage for food, and maintain security against German anti-partisan campaigns. The fact that this infrastructure was built and maintained while under constant threat of German attack demonstrated the organisational capability of the Soviet partisan movement at its peak. The operational statistics for partisan aviation were remarkable given the primitive conditions. During 1943, Soviet Air Force units assigned to partisan supply flew approximately 12,000 sorties to partisan-controlled areas, delivering over 3,000 tons of supplies and evacuating more than 4,000 personnel. The PO-2 biplanes that performed these missions operated at night in all weather conditions, navigated by dead reckoning to forest clearings marked only by campfires, landed on unprepared surfaces, and returned before dawn to avoid German fighters. The casualty rate was significant, with dozens of crews lost to crashes, weather, or German interception, but the missions continued because partisan forces depended on this lifeline. The coordination required for these operations was sophisticated. Partisan commanders submitted supply requests via radio to Soviet headquarters, specifying what was needed and where it should be delivered. Flight planners coordinated with partisan units to ensure airstrips would be prepared, security established, and ground crew available for the specified delivery time. Weather reports were collected from partisan observers throughout the forest, providing pilots with information about conditions along flight routes. Radio operators at partisan airstrips maintained continuous contact with approaching aircraft, providing guidance for the final approach and warning of any problems. The psychological impact of functioning airstrips in partisan-controlled territory extended beyond the military value of supplies and evacuations. For partisan fighters, the sight of Soviet aircraft landing in the forest provided tangible evidence that they were not abandoned, that the Soviet government maintained commitment to their struggle, that they were part of a larger war effort rather than isolated guerrillas forgotten by their leadership. For local civilians living in partisan-controlled areas, the airstrips demonstrated that Soviet power remained real despite German occupation, encouraging cooperation with partisan authorities rather than submission to German administration. For German forces, the existence of partisan airstrips represented a fundamental failure of occupation policy. Territory marked on maps as German-controlled was in reality administered by Soviet partisan command, complete with functioning logistics infrastructure that included aviation facilities. German units stationed in Belarus lived in fortified garrisons, venturing into the countryside only in large formations protected by armour and artillery. The nominal occupation was hollow, with German authority extending only as far as their weapons could reach, while vast tracts of forest operated as Soviet-controlled enclaves deep behind the front line. The airstrip system also facilitated offensive operations that would otherwise be impossible. Partisan commanders could coordinate attacks on German railways and supply depots with Soviet frontline forces, timing their sabotage operations to coincide with Red Army offensives. Specialists in demolitions, intelligence, and communications could be delivered to partisan units planning major operations, providing expertise that transformed ambushes and raids into sophisticated military campaigns. The ability to evacuate partisan fighters after particularly dangerous missions meant commanders could risk bold operations without necessarily sacrificing their entire unit if things went wrong. Winter posed special challenges for partisan airstrip operations that transformed already dangerous missions into desperate gambles against weather, darkness, and mechanical failure. Snow cover made runways difficult to maintain, as fresh snow needed to be packed down before aircraft could land safely. Partisan ground crews worked through the night before scheduled supply flights, using wooden mallets and their own body weight to compact snow along the runway's length. This was exhausting work in sub-zero temperatures, with workers' breath forming ice crystals on their scarves and eyebrows, hands going numb inside inadequate gloves. If snowfall continued during work, the process became futile, with fresh snow accumulating faster than crews could compact it. Temperatures well below freezing caused aircraft engines to freeze if not kept running, limiting time on the ground to a few minutes that required perfect coordination between pilot and ground crew. The M11 radial engine powering the P-02 used castor oil as lubricant, which became thick and viscous in cold temperatures. Starting a cold engine in winter required preheating the oil by draining it, warming it over a fire, and pouring it back into the engine immediately before attempting to start. This procedure couldn't be performed on a forest airstrip where fires might attract German attention, so pilots had to land, complete their mission, and take off before the engine cooled enough to prevent restart. 10 minutes was considered safe, 15 minutes was risky, 20 minutes meant the engine might not restart, leaving the aircraft stranded on a partisan airstrip until dawn, when German reconnaissance would inevitably spot it. Shorter daylight hours meant night operations extended into periods when navigation by visual reference was almost impossible. Winter nights in Belarus lasted up to 16 hours, with true darkness from 1600 to 0800 hours. Pilots had to time their missions to arrive during the darkest hours when German observation was least likely, but this meant flying in total blackness where even the horizon disappeared, making it impossible to judge aircraft attitude without instruments the P-02 didn't carry. Disorientation was common, with pilots losing sense of whether they were climbing, descending, or banking, sometimes discovering they were flying inverted only when the altimeter showed impossible readings, or the engine sputtered from fuel starvation as gravity fought carburetor design. But winter also provided advantages that made these operations possible despite the increased risks. Frozen ground created harder runway surfaces that didn't develop ruts or soft spots that might catch landing gear. The compacted snow over frozen earth provided excellent load-bearing capacity, actually superior to summer soil that could become soft after rainfall. Snow cover made camouflage easier by naturally concealing runway edges and blending cleared areas into the surrounding forest landscape. German aerial reconnaissance was less effective in winter because snow made everything white, eliminating the contrast between natural meadows and cleared runways that summer photography revealed. And German forces reduced anti-partisan operations during the harshest winter months, when their troops lacked proper cold weather equipment and vehicles struggled with snow-covered forest roads. This meant partisan-controlled areas were relatively safer in winter, allowing airstrip operations to continue with less risk of German ground attack. As the Red Army advanced westward in 1944, liberating territory that had been under German occupation since 1941, the partisan airstrip network became less critical for supplying partisan forces and more important for facilitating the transition from partisan control to restored Soviet administration. Communist Party officials flew into formerly partisan-controlled areas to re-establish government authority. NKVD officers arrived to investigate partisan units for political reliability, identifying any members who might have collaborated with Germans or developed excessive independence during years of operating without direct supervision. Military officers assessed which partisan fighters should be integrated into Red Army units and which should be demobilized. The fate of partisan airstrips after liberation varied. Some were expanded into permanent military airfields, particularly those in strategic locations near major roads or railways. The runways were properly graded, drainage systems installed, support buildings constructed, transforming crude forest clearings into functional air bases. Others were abandoned, allowed to return to forest as trees grew back and vegetation reclaimed the cleared areas. A few were preserved as historical sites, memorials to the partisan movement's contribution to Soviet victory. The political complications of partisan service emerged during this transition period. Partisan fighters who had survived years behind enemy lines, building infrastructure, conducting military operations, and maintaining Soviet presence in occupied territory expected recognition for their service. Instead, many faced suspicion from Soviet authorities who questioned how anyone could survive so long under German occupation without collaboration. The fact that partisan units had sometimes requisitioned food from local populations by force, creating resentment among civilians, complicated their status. Some partisan commanders who had exercised essentially independent authority for years resisted reintegration into the rigid Soviet military hierarchy. The airstrip construction and operation provided one clear measure of partisan organizational capability that Soviet authorities couldn't easily dispute. Building 50 functional airstrips required planning, engineering expertise, labor organization, security, and maintenance that demonstrated genuine military competence rather than simply survival in the forest. Partisan commanders could point to the airstrip network as proof they had maintained discipline, followed orders from Soviet headquarters, and contributed meaningfully to the war effort rather than merely hiding from German forces. The German response to partisan airstrips evolved slowly, hampered by fundamental misunderstanding of partisan warfare. German military doctrine emphasized conventional operations, identified enemy positions, massed forces, attacked with armor and artillery support, occupied territory, held it with fortified positions. This approach worked against regular Soviet forces, but failed completely against partisans who melted into forests, avoided direct confrontation, and returned after German forces withdrew. Finding and destroying partisan airstrips required different tactics: extensive intelligence networks, rapid response forces capable of reaching remote locations quickly, sustained occupation of vast forested areas. German security divisions assigned to anti-partisan operations lacked the resources for effective response. These units were typically composed of older soldiers, former Soviet prisoners of war who agreed to serve Germany, and foreign volunteers whose reliability was questionable. They lacked the training, equipment, and motivation needed for aggressive operations in hostile terrain against an enemy who knew every trail and hiding place. When they did locate partisan positions, their slow movement and predictable tactics allowed partisans to evacuate before German forces arrived. The few German units capable of effective anti-partisan operations, usually SS formations or specialized counterinsurgency troops, were needed elsewhere. The Eastern Front consumed enormous resources, requiring every available combat-capable unit. German command couldn't afford to deploy effective forces against partisans when those forces were desperately needed to prevent Red Army breakthroughs at the front. The result was that partisan-controlled areas behind German lines became almost autonomous zones where Soviet authority functioned openly despite nominal German occupation. Today, the sites of partisan airstrips are mostly forgotten, identified only by subtle irregularities in the forest. clearings slightly larger than natural meadows, old drainage ditches overgrown with vegetation, occasional pieces of rusted equipment half buried in forest soil. Local residents in Belarus sometimes remember stories from grandparents about the partisan airstrips, about the sound of PO2 engines echoing through the forest at night, about campfires lit along the runways, about wounded partisans being carried to aircraft for evacuation. But these memories are fading as the generation that witnessed these events dies. No comprehensive map exists showing all partisan airstrip locations. Soviet records documented many sites but not all, and some documentation was lost or destroyed. German intelligence reports identified suspected partisan airstrips, but these reports were often inaccurate or based on outdated information. Archaeological surveys occasionally discover former airstrip sites identified by unusual soil compaction patterns visible in ground-penetrating radar or by distinctive vegetation growth where forest clearings were artificially created decades ago. The engineering achievement represented by partisan airstrips is rarely appreciated in histories of World War II. Building 50 functional airfields using hand tools and partisan labour while under constant threat of German attack required remarkable organisational capability and technical expertise. The fact that these crude facilities supported thousands of successful flight operations demonstrated that functional infrastructure doesn't require sophisticated equipment, only intelligent planning and dedicated execution. The strategic impact of partisan airstrips on the Eastern Front's outcome is difficult to quantify. Supplying 500,000 partisan fighters who disrupted German rear areas, destroyed railways, and tied down security divisions that might otherwise reinforce the front line clearly contributed to Soviet victory. Whether airstrips were essential to this contribution or merely enhanced it remains debatable. Partisan forces operated before airstrips existed, supplied only by parachute drops, and they could have continued without airstrip-based logistics. But the airstrips transformed partisan warfare from desperate survival into organized military operations, integrated with overall Soviet strategy. The human story of partisan airstrips centers on collaboration between two groups with very different experiences. The partisan fighters living in the forest under constant threat, and the Soviet aviators flying missions into that darkness to connect partisan territory with the outside world. These groups developed mutual respect born from shared danger. Pilots understood that partisans lit fires along runways, knowing this might attract German forces, risking their own security to guide aircraft. Partisans understood that pilots navigated through darkness and weather to clearings barely large enough for safe landing, trusting partisan ground crew to maintain runways adequately despite having no aviation engineering training. The PO2 pilots who flew these missions were often women, members of the famous Night Witches Regiment and other all-female aviation units. They faced the same dangers as male pilots: crashes, weather, German fighters, navigation errors that ended with aircraft lost in forests, miles from intended landing sites. But they also faced skepticism from male partisan commanders who didn't believe women could be effective combat aviators. The fact that female pilots proved to be as capable as their male counterparts, flying the same dangerous missions with comparable success rates, gradually changed attitudes within partisan units toward women in military roles. The partisan airstrip system represented something unusual in wartime logistics, a bottom-up solution to supply problems rather than a top-down planned infrastructure. Soviet military planners initially focused on parachute drops as the primary means of supplying partisans. Partisan commanders on the ground recognized this was inadequate and began building their own airstrips with whatever resources they could improvise. Soviet High Command eventually supported this initiative, providing specialist teams and formal organization, but the basic concept and many individual airstrips originated with partisan initiative rather than central planning. This pattern of improvisation and adaptation characterized much of Soviet partisan warfare. Official Soviet histories emphasize central planning and party leadership, portraying partisan operations as carefully coordinated by Moscow from the beginning. Reality was messier. Early partisan units formed spontaneously from Red Army soldiers cut off by German advances, local communists, and civilians fleeing German occupation. Many operated for months or years without contact with Soviet command, making their own decisions based on local conditions. The airstrip network reflected this reality, local solutions to local problems that eventually coalesced into a larger system with Moscow's support. The question of whether partisan airstrips constitute airports in the conventional sense depends on definitions. They lacked everything normally associated with airports: control towers, navigation aids, weather stations, maintenance facilities, fuel storage, accommodation for crews. They were simply flat pieces of ground where aircraft could land, surrounded by forest and camouflage to prevent detection. But they functioned as airports in the essential sense, locations where aircraft regularly landed and departed, supporting sustained aviation operations over multiple years. The distinction between crude wartime expedient and functional airport dissolves when examining what these sites actually accomplished. The lessons from partisan airstrips remained relevant long after World War II ended. Irregular forces operating behind enemy lines still need logistic support, and simple landing strips in remote areas remain an effective solution when proper airfields are unavailable or too vulnerable to enemy attack. Military forces operating in jungle, mountain, or desert terrain have built improvised landing sites using techniques essentially unchanged from those employed by Soviet partisans in the forests of Belarus. The fundamental principle remains valid. An aircraft that can land almost anywhere needs only minimal infrastructure, as long as someone on the ground knows how to prepare that infrastructure. The Soviet partisan movement built 50 airstrips in occupied territory using hand tools and partisan labor. The Red Air Force flew 12,000 missions to these airstrips, delivering supplies and evacuating personnel, maintaining an aerial bridge between partisan-controlled areas and Soviet territory. And the Germans, despite controlling the territory on maps and maintaining occupation forces throughout Belarus, never succeeded in permanently closing this aerial supply line. The territory on maps and maintaining occupation forces throughout Belarus never succeeded in permanently closing this aerial supply line.